Now, truth was, I couldn't think of anyone who liked him, but what happened was the guy got real. And when he got real, I wanted to be of help to this guy. And I thought, what a powerful lesson about being real. When I work with leaders of organizations, one of the first things I talk about is, will you just be vulnerable? Will you just tell them that you're screwing up too? Because when you tell them that, it creates the place for them to go, I'm trying my best, I'm making mistakes, but I'm not having to cover them up because it's okay to make mistakes. I'm going to make this happen. And when people are vulnerable at the top, what do the people below them do? They work harder. They want to pick up the dust. They want to clean it up. They want to make sure it's okay. They want that person to succeed because that person is real. I was speaking at a CEO conference one time, and there was a bank CEO who came to me and said, before you leave town, could you come and just come into my bank and just tell me what you think? So I called that bank prior to going there, and as I called the bank, they answered the phone. Hello. I said, I'm sorry, I must have the wrong number. And she says, well, who do you want? I said, well, I was calling for a bank. She said, this is a bank. Who do you want? Now, clearly she was annoyed. And things weren't working well at this bank, I could tell. And so I walked into that bank later on, and as I walked into that bank, it had that essence of marble. You know, you walk into the bank, and as you walk in, you can hear your heels go click, 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 click. And you're thinking if you needed a loan, it would sound like this. I need a loan, okay? And I noticed that the people all had Parts disease. If you know what Parts disease is, it's parts, just everywhere. No one looked up. No one made eye contact. No one cared. And so I waited for a while for the CEO to get off the phone. And while I was waiting, I observed many behaviors. And so when it was time for me to go into his office to tell him what I observed, we sat down and I looked him in the eye and I said, Jack, they're not having any fun out there. And he said, he got up, he closed the door, he came back, he had a tear rolling down his cheek. And he said to me, I hate this place. I said, it shows. Because the reality is that he, as the leader of that place, created an essence such that no one could enjoy what they did. There was no celebration of success. There was no fun. There was no high-fiving. There was no way to go. Everyone was in a place of misery because this man had a wounded feeling function. He couldn't feel, and as the leader of the organization, they couldn't feel either. And I thought to myself, just think of these employees. They go home at night, and how they feel about themselves. Not so good. And how does that impact the people around them? Their marriages and their children and the dogs and the cats, for God's sakes. Everybody's being kicked, right? We need to perform at an extraordinary level. Every one of us has inside of us that need to kick butt, take names, make things happen. And yet, if it doesn't happen in an organization, somebody's got to make it happen. I don't think it's always the leader. I think leader is not a position. I think leader is a way of being. So the key is a vision statement compels. In addition to have a vision statement, you need to understand what it is that gets people excited about what they do. And one of those things is understanding that when it's their idea, they come alive. Let me give you an example. Those of us who have raised a 2-year-old, we all know that the favorite word of a 2-year-old is no. Exactly. And yet, as adults, all we are is highly socialized 2-year-olds. And so when somebody asks us to do something, our first inclination is to say no, except for we're highly socialized, so we say things like, I'm afraid I have several different initiatives ahead of that, so I'll have to see when I can get that done. And a million different ways to say no because we have not engaged. And the reason we have not engaged is it's not our idea. And yet when a healthy company understands how to really include their people and get them passionate, they know how to make it feel like their ideas and pull people in so it really feels like their idea and it really is their idea. Because once it's their idea, they know exactly what they want to make happen. It's time that we talk about the things that get in the way. There are so many things that get in the way because every organization has a soul. The soul is that passion, that aliveness, that desire to be great. People come to work their very first day of work, their shoes are shined. They're there early and they can't wait to make a significant difference. They are alive and passionate, and they start that first day. And suddenly, after a few days, they come a little bit later. Their shoes aren't shined because they see the behaviors that I call soul robbers. Every organization has a soul. It's that aliveness and that passion to want to be extraordinary, but the things that we do take it away. And let me give you some examples of some of those things. I worked with a company in Minnesota when I first moved there, and there's a big difference between Wisconsin and Minnesota culturally. I don't know if any of you kind of crossed the border, but like two different worlds, right? I mean, in Wisconsin, everybody's kind of huggy, and, you open your front door and people come in by themselves. They don't need an invitation, and I would make food when I lived in Wisconsin, and I'm a horrible cook, but people would show up and eat it. I didn't have to invite them. I move across that state border, and, if they don't give them 2 weeks' notice, they're not coming. It's just a different experience. And there's this thing called Minnesota Nice, which basically means I'll be friendly to you, but I'm not letting you into my heart. I'm keeping you kind of at a distance. And many people who have moved there from other states say the same thing. It's kind of a phenomenon for anybody who's moved in. I didn't realize when I lived this close that was the case. So I moved into the state of Minnesota, and I thought to myself, how will this impact the work that I do with Minnesota companies? Sure enough, I get to find out right away. I was hired to speak on the topic of change to a sales group of about 150 salespeople who were making well into the six figures. They were some high-producing salespeople. And prior to coming to work with this group, I had asked lots of questions to find out how they were doing and what was working as a company, what wasn't working, but they didn't tell me all the truth, which I discovered the morning of the speech. And the first thing that happened, I walk in that day, and there's a gentleman in the hallway with a red polo shirt. And I saw this man, and I thought to myself, whoa, something's up. So I went to the sales manager, and I said to her, I have never seen an angrier man. What's going on with this guy in the red polo shirt? And she said, oh my God, you found Herb. I told my husband they find me dead. It was Herb. Herb was the kind of guy who you thought could implode at any minute. He was just one angry guy. And so basically they started the program by the CEO going behind the podium, and he was completely in his head, not at all in his heart, no connection with the humans out there, just only a connection with his stuff. And he began to read off of his paper, these are the new initiatives we're taking to the market. These are the new product releases. Here's how we're restructuring the market territories. By the way, last year our sales were half of what they were the year before. I'm thinking, half of what they were? And then he said, last year we lost half of our sales force. Must be mad cow disease. I am sitting in the back of the room, and I'm thinking to myself, this is huge. This is horrible. What I would expect for people who are sitting in the audience would be for them to go, this is terrible, and to be just kind of in a place of, we got to get this turned around. But no, they were being Minnesota nice, no emotion, just completely detached from the whole thing with no connection. Now, how many of you grew up in a dysfunctional family? Raise your hands if you... A dysfunctional family is not a family with problems. It's a family that doesn't talk about the problems. They were a dysfunctional family because they weren't talking about it. The place was coming down around them, and nobody was owning up to it. And so I started the program that day thinking to myself, they hired the wrong speaker because they do not need a program on change. They need a kick in the butt to get them going in the right direction to get this business turned around. So I started that program that day by saying this. If I were to split this room in half, and I said, those of you who would do whatever it took to make this work, I want you over here. And those of you who have your resume going through the fax machine on a daily basis, over here, I have this sense that we'd be kind of lopsided. But the reality is, you can go someplace else, but you'll create the same thing because you created this. It was the people who were here that created this. And unless you know how to break through this, you will create this again someplace else. And so I want you just to imagine for just the day that we can make this work. And I want you to be as if this is a company that's going to be one of the biggest turnarounds that ever hit. And so I began to work with them. I got them slowly to start to tell the truth because it was not a safe place to tell the truth. It was very, very clear. So I had them write down on a piece of paper with their hands covering it. Then I had them slowly share it with a partner. Then I got them to talk out loud about what wasn't working. And then all of a sudden they started fighting back and forth. And I'm thinking, this is good. They need to be yelling at each other and have some passion about getting this thing turned around. And then they created a vision that was just outstanding about where they were going to take this company. And at this point, they're jazzed. They're thinking, we could do this, we could do this. And then one guy says, we got to have goals. We got to know where we're going. So one guy said, we got to grow this thing 10%. Somebody else said, are you crazy? We got to grow this thing 50% because we are in so much trouble. Somebody else said, are you crazy? We got to grow this 100%. At which point Herb stands up. We're all thinking, oh boy. He slams his fist on the table. The room shook, and he shouts, I run marathons. When I say I'm running to the finish line, I don't stop till I get to the end. I say we go to the end. I'm so tired of you guys complaining and whining about why we can't get there. We just need to go there. And the place got kind of quiet, and all of a sudden they started looking at each other going, yeah. 6 months later, they were written up in the Minneapolis Tribune. Their sales were up 106%. Why? Because somebody stood for it. Somebody decided to. Wasn't a leader, was on the outskirts of the company. He pulled them around by deciding to stand for something. When I work with organizations, one of the first things I do is I look for the bottlenecks. What's the problem? What aren't they working through? What's getting in the way that keeps them from performing at the level that they need to be performing? And I find all kinds of different bottlenecks, but usually it has to do with the people stuff. And usually it has to do with the acceptance of excuses. Now, excuses are one of those things that come in really handy. Doc Madison, I'm late for class because my dog died. Okay, whatever. Okay, so they have an excuse, right? And so if we allow the excuses, what happens the next day? Their cat died, okay? They just find another excuse because we bought into the excuse. Now, if you happen to be my child, here's what you get when you get an excuse. My son will be in therapy when he's 30 because every time he comes to me with an excuse, I basically do something very mature and stick my fingers in my ears and I say, I'm not listening. Because I don't want to hear the stories. I only want to hear about what can you create. So if you hit a roadblock, great. What will you do about it? Nobody's asking you to be perfect, but I am asking you not to live in this story and the excuse. Because the biggest problem I see with organizations is the story. Now, I just heard the budget is being cut by 38%. Okay, so there's a couple ways that you could deal with this. I was working with a hospital several years ago that basically had that same kind of percentage potential cut. Now, this was one of the best hospitals in the country. Now, when they got this cut, they went into chaos. People were whining and complaining and being in the place of misery. They couldn't imagine how they were going to make this thing work. They were sure that they were going to go from being one of the best organizations to one of the worst organizations overnight. They were in the whining state. They had hired me a year before to speak on leadership. Now, they did not need a program on leadership. I'm usually hired for something that they really need. Because they didn't need a program on leadership. They needed to get unstuck about this belief system that they needed that money. And really what we talked about was, if you were always the best organization and every other hospital is going to be cut too, why couldn't you figure this thing out? I mean, are you really willing to let those kind of cuts keep you from being extraordinary in the work that you do? And they created a whole different way of thinking and a whole different way of being because they chose to know that it was important enough to get beyond it. So I have this little thing I'm going to give you when you go back into your workplaces and people give you an excuse for anything. And they say, here's why we can't, here's why we can't. The only thing that you can say back is, well, how can you? Well, how can you? Well, how can you? Well, how can you? The broken record of how can you is the only thing that keeps organizations functional because when we buy into people's stories and excuses, we limit them from their possibilities in a huge way. At some point, you need to have the conversation. When I say the conversation, what I mean is that conversation that really gets to the heart of matters because sometimes people just don't decide to come in. That conversation goes like this. Julie, I am so excited about where this organization is, and my sense is that you don't share that excitement, but I want you to know that's okay. Because maybe this isn't your thing, but if it isn't your thing, you got to go find your thing. This is your life. You see, at some point you need to have that conversation with people where you say, it's not your fault, maybe it's us, but if this isn't it, you got to go find your it. Because when you have that conversation, one of two things will happen. Number one, they might free up their future. But number two, they may say, you're right. For some reason, I've been resistant. I haven't let this company in, and I need to. I need to come in. And I apologize for those past behaviors, and I'm in. And that's the kind of employee that then is alive and passionate and on your team, and miracles begin to happen. Life ought to be a struggle of desire.